I think it's that one. All right. I'm getting the thumbs up from Charlie. So that means we are live. So let me welcome everybody that's here in the sanctuary, and obviously anybody that's joining us virtually. So just as a matter of housekeeping, if you are joining us virtually, Reggie provided me his cell phone number, and as we've done in some of our members' meetings and those sorts of things, you can text Reggie if you have specific questions. So Reggie's number is 676-2676. So again, that's 676-2676. So at any point tonight, as we go through a couple of different items, if you want to text Pastor and raise any questions, we'll be happy to entertain those. And then I'll cover kind of the next steps towards the end. But let me go ahead and open us up in some prayer this evening. Gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you and are so grateful for the blessings that you bestow on us, and that we in turn, out of the overpouring of faith and hope that we have in our hearts, we give that back to you by way of our tithes and our offerings, and our church budget certainly represents that. So we take this very seriously and appreciate the opportunity to talk through these things and review the spiritual mutual fund, so to speak, that you've allowed us to establish that brings your kingdom about. And Lord, I pray tonight will be an opportunity for us to talk through those things and what our church looks like in 2021 from a budget perspective, and that would encourage people's hearts and help us to focus on the mission that we have of bringing the good news to those that need it the most and around the world. So it's in your holy and heavenly name we pray. Amen. So a couple things before we get started. I want to say thanks to Charlie. He took some slides that I put together and then had to completely redo them to make them in the format that he wanted. So I've learned, and I will send them to him differently for next time. So, and then, there are a host of folks that are involved in this process, that I don't know that last year we kind of talked through this, but you guys have heard it a couple different times. We've talked about our Proverbs 3:9 group that we have, and that's been a little different in the COVID environment. We've had a couple of Zoom calls and some dialogue with that group over the last couple of months, and went through some of the budget discussions. And so, there's a wonderful group that is part of that. And I would encourage anyone, whether you're here in person or you're on the live stream and want to join us in those discussions. You don't have to be a financial wizard or anything of that nature, because goodness knows I am not, but we would welcome you to join us and help us navigate different things. So I want to say thanks to that group. And then also Ginger does just a lion's share of the work with the budget. So she takes all the information that I kind of regurgitate back during the process and makes it in a format where we can read it and digest it a little bit. So I appreciate all the work that Ginger does. And then really, obviously want to thank everybody from the congregation as well, because tonight, we'll review some things. We'll take a formal vote next Sunday. Ginger, is that correct? Is it next Sunday, I believe? Yeah, so this next Sunday we'll actually formally vote to approve the budget for next year, and that follows our bylaw process. So we presented it last Sunday. It was available. So I guess it's 2 Sundays from now, isn't it, Ginger? So it'd be Sunday after next. And per our process and our bylaws, we table it for a period of time and we want to have this review to give us a week on the other side of that to talk through any questions anyone has. So if you have any feedback or anything after tonight, it's not as if the budget is complete, done. I hope we don't have a ton of changes, because that's just loads of fun for Ginger and I to have to do that, but we do welcome any feedback that you would have. So what I'm going to do is spend some time just going through some detail, and then we'll leave plenty of time at the end. I'll keep an eye on my watch for just questions and answers and those sort of things. I really wanted to start, though, to talk a little bit about the budget, not just about the numbers, but when we talk about our church budget, it really is more than just a document, okay? So it is a ledger type document that helps us track expenses and those sort of things, but it's important to understand how deeply God cares about our budget. Now I'm going to talk about a couple aspects of that, but our budget says a great deal about what we value as a congregation, where we know from Scripture where we put our money and our time and our energy is where our heart's at. And so what we do with our church budget, just like any of our other resources that we use, really says a lot about our church, our congregation, our people, and how we serve. So the budget, God cares a great deal about how we use it. Now, we also have to keep in mind that God doesn't need it. So God does not need our budget. He does not need, we do not have to have a mindset that because we are such great stewards of what He's given the church, or that in some way or shape or form has this just magnificent impact, because at the end of the day, God can achieve His objective and His will for the world without our church budget. So while it is very, very important, it is also something that we have to understand, especially as we're going to talk here in a second about how our giving may change and all these sorts of things, that doesn't dictate our effectiveness as a church or the ministries we can do, because we've seen, even through this pandemic, and I'm going to talk a lot about that tonight, I know Reggie's mentioned, the amazing way that our congregation has shown up and shown off the hope that they have in Christ by way of their giving. Even though we'll talk about some of the numbers, but it's been tremendous. When you look at an economy, to talk about the numbers for a second, that is 30% below GDP in some areas, and to know the church here as we sit in our church is about 3.5% roughly behind where we were last year, which I would dare say does not represent where people's finances are at right now. And so that shows the faithfulness of our congregation. But it's very important to God, but He doesn't need it. So any shortfall or excess we have in our budget does not dictate our effectiveness as a congregation or as a church. And ultimately, our goal in using our church budget is just like what we would say about any of our ministry areas or any of the things that we do. We are called to be faithful in our stewardship and to be found faithful in that. And if you study some of the scripture that I've tried to really spend a lot of time on as we go through the financial processes, there's really two components. There's being obedient to what we're called to do, and then as we talked about, I think last year when we talked about the budget, there's a degree of risk in that. We are taking finances that, whether it's things that we focus on as a church or whether it's you individually being faithful in your giving, that the world would say use it differently, spend it differently, do something else with it. Make the building this big glorious example that people just want to pour into, and it may be empty on the inside and it looks beautiful on the outside. And that's, we want to do some things around renovation, some other things we're going to talk about, but that's not what God calls us to do with our budget. So in being a good steward of what we're called to do, it's about being obedient to the calling we have to take the gospel around the world, but also to understand there's risk involved in that. There's risk as we may send missionaries out and spend and invest in that, and it doesn't come to fruition, or something happens, and that's okay, right? So, and we'll talk some more about that as we go through some of the different pieces of the budget. But, and as I said a minute ago, our budget really shows the world how good and excellent God is, because there's a lot of folks right now that are very focused on, the stock market does this, whatever, and this is how I react in my life, and our faithfulness in what we do in giving and how we show up and use our finances to support God's work in the church is not dictated by financial markets. It's not dictated by, so that shows to the world we have a different hope, that we are investing in a spiritual mutual fund, which I think I've got that in another slide, that when we all reach heaven, and we hope we meet people that were impacted by the good news of Christ because of something that we did individually in our giving, right? And so it's an investment, and that shows a picture to the world of what we value, and I think even more so in this time, because I can personally say, and being close and familiar with a lot of nonprofits, if we're going to look at it in that vein, there are a lot of nonprofits that are struggling right now. They're struggling to make their budgets. They're struggling to, and while we have our own challenges as a church, we are not. And I think that's because the hope that we have is in something different than a nonprofit organization. While there are some tremendous organizations out there, we don't face those same, and that says a lot about the goodness of God and His faithfulness. And then ultimately, when we think about it, Matthew 28 and the Great Commission is really the purpose, right? To use that spiritual mutual fund, as I said, to invest in something that we may never see. If you think about Hebrews, we may never see that come to fruition in the dollars that we give, because it may be well past our time on this earth that makes an impact on the world. But there's a legacy that we leave as we work through our finances here at Heritage that carries on and just further prospect the gospel around the world and in our community. So that's the investment we're making when we talk about our church budget. So I just wanted to touch on those points because I think sometimes it's easy to jump straight into the numbers and what does this line look like and that line like. But you know, my prayer that, and I probably daily pray over just our finances and our budget, not that giving will be strong but that we are good stewards and we're found faithful in that, and that our congregation's found faithful in that. So I wanted to touch on those before we get into the actual budget itself. So let's talk about the structure. And for those of you that picked up one of the sheets as you walked in, if you didn't, feel free to run back out in the lobby. There's some on the table up there. Or it was actually emailed out today in the Connect. There's a link in the Connect. If you have access to your email and you're watching via live stream, you can grab that and pull it up online. I'm going to go into more detail than what you have on that sheet in front of you, just so we didn't have to print 8 pages per person, because our budget is pretty complex. But I'm going to break it down and talk about each individual section. So really, the first line you're going to see there is our contribution. So that's obviously our giving. What you'll notice on the document that was provided is we've adjusted that a little bit, because obviously as we've gone through this pandemic situation, because we don't behave, so to speak, like a business would in terms of profit, loss margin, those sort of things. We account for every dime of revenue that we have and try and translate that over into the expenses that we have. And so it's really behooves us to do some due diligence on the front end to make sure that we have the best idea of what our contributions are going to look like, so that we can set our budgets in the individual ministry areas appropriately to that. We would not want to set a budget that's, $1.3 million if we really feel like we'll barely make over $1 million. That would not be a wise way to go about our budget process. And so as we saw the trend of what we have this year, and some of it, I have no doubt, is not an indication of people not being faithful. I think only being 3.5% behind where we were last year is a huge indication of how faithful our congregation is. But we also know that folks have had to make adjustments in many things, and that's very much could be indicative of where they're at financially or different things. And so, and then we've had some movement of some families and such around the church. And so as you see that, you see different mechanisms that go with the budget associated with that. So when we look at our contributions, we've reduced it by roughly $48,000 for next year. That lines up, and it's going to almost hit on the dollar, I think, and Ginger's shaking her head back there, that, we're about 34 or so behind, that's that 3.5%. If we look at it right now, we're about 34,000 behind where we were last year. So even with some year-end giving being a little stronger that we probably expect in previous years, this year year-end giving may be a little different. So that's just the best calculated guess we have on where our giving will round out, just based on our trend that we've seen. So there's not a magic formula per se. We're not going into each individual giver's ledger, so to speak, and trying to add it up. We just look at where we're trending and what we've been running, and then kind of input that appropriately. So that's how we came to the contribution line, and you'll notice that's about $880,000 that's associated with our just general offerings, and then we've got 120 in our missions line, and then budgeted general fund we've got another 52, which equals the $1,052,000. So that's a reduction from last year's budget of $48,000. So that's really the contribution piece. Let me talk about each expense area just briefly, and then I'm going to go into detail in each area. So our administrative expenses represent about 47% of the budget. That is largely salaries and insurance and things associated with the administration side of what we do in the church. So one thing that Ginger has been great at doing is going through some comparisons and different things, and some networking she does with other churches. And so she looks at how, as churches submit information, how do we stack up as the way that we budget versus other churches? We look at it by congregation size, that sort of thing. So I can tell you, I am really honored and proud of what we look at in terms of, because in some churches the capital and profits or property side is much heavily, more so than like our missions, for instance, makes up 12% of our budget. I think the average is about 9%, 10%, somewhere lower, even lower than that in some churches. So our focus on missions is a little higher as a percentage of our budget. But so the administrative support and the ministry areas is pretty much right in line with where a lot of churches are. So that's not, I mean, obviously, as you can imagine, if you get a very large congregation, they have other administrative functions, but that just makes up the salaries and taxes or insurance and things like that with our administrative folks. Ministry support areas, I'll go through those line by line, but that's like anything we do ministry related, from our elders to our children's ministries to youth to women's ministries, those sorts of things. So that's where those ministry areas come in. Our deacons fall under that. Our missions budget, obviously, and David's here tonight. If you got specific questions around missions, we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll cover that. Property, obviously, is where we sit in the building, and that involves everything from the heat and air that we turn on to the parking lot maintenance to the those sorts of things. So that kind of represents the fiscal plant, if you will, here. And then the capital is just, I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about reserve funding and a different model we're using for that this year that I'm really excited about, that I know Ginger was tremendously helpful, and a lot of people gave us some feedback on that. But our capital is just investments we need to make in upkeep of the facilities and those sorts of things, and that's a line item where we set that aside. So. And then obviously our office and technology, there's a lot of printing, there's a lot of, particularly this year with our live streaming and all the different IT mechanisms that we have to employ there, there's an expense associated with that. We upgraded some network infrastructure and some other things this year, and invested in some things up with our live stream booth and all those things. Some of them have monthly memberships, those sort of things. So that's what goes into that office and technology line. So that's just a breakdown percentage-wise of where each one of our areas falls. And I can tell you, we lean heavier on our missions than we do in some of our other areas, which does make us a little different than the norm that you see in other congregations. And I personally am very proud of that, and I think it says a lot there again about what we value and where we put our dollars. Not to speak negatively of anybody that has a different structure than that, but I think we have tremendous hope in the mission that we're called to, and that's where we put our dollars. So let me spend some time going through the different lines. Won't spend a great deal of time on the administrative side. We didn't really make any changes there because, as you all know, we've not had any changes from a staff or any of that type of perspective. Probably the $3,600 or so that changed basically is related to insurance and mostly on the new van, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second. So really that was just as you would expect, year-over-year increase in some insurance costs and things like that. So that was the only associated change with our administrative line item, was really in insurance and payroll taxes. So as we go through the ministry support area, and you guys should have some detail in the document in front of you, our elder expense, we didn't make any changes there. We really do hope to be able to attend. We were very excited right before the pandemic hit. I think, oddly enough, I believe, as God's providence would have it, had we gone to 9 Marks, which is what we planned to, I would have been riding in the van with everybody up there basically COVID positive. So that probably would not have been a good thing for the rest of our pastors. But we literally shut that down, I think, the same week that I got sick and back in March and was off the grid for 2 weeks. So we were really excited about that trip. So the budget from the elder line really represents some funding that we've got set aside. We've already paid for that trip. To go up to 9 Marks with Capitol Hill Baptist in D.C. and really spend several days with their elder model and learning from some tremendous men that have a lot of experience in church leadership and that sort of thing. So we're excited about that. So there's some other things that we do with the elder budget from year to year, but that's the lion's share of that. Next line is our senior focused ministry, and so we didn't make any adjustments there. I will say our seniors are wonderful in the way they give and how they go above and beyond oftentimes and offer designated funds when they have a need to do something they want to do. They come together and often will offer up designated funds that are kind of above and beyond what our normal budget would be set. So normally that just represents the different events and things we do throughout the year for our seniors. When we go down to our hospitality ministry, Charlie and his team have done such a wonderful job for us this year talking about how we needed to welcome folks and not just the gifts and things we talk about on Sunday in terms of the the coffee mugs and the T-shirts, but how can we be very outwardly focused on that as people come into the church and we welcome them, and so really focused on a visitor ministry and that sort of thing. So we've made some adjustments based on some feedback Charlie had and his team that we can better support that financially. So that's the $1,000 increase you see in that line item. Our library, we were really excited. We actually had budgeted more than this for in the library fund because we wanted to really upgrade some of the IT kind of infrastructure in there. My daughter reads about 100 books a month, I think. I've never met a child that reads, and she just loves our library. And I can attest to the conversation I have with other members who they themselves or their family really enjoys using our library. And it needs a little bit of an upgrade in terms of the checkout, check-in process. There's some online, reservation type models that are out there. And we were ready to invest in that to try and make that a nice model. And someone actually stepped up and basically funded about half of that, right, Ginger? And so we budgeted for the other part of that, so we're going to be able to do that whole upgrade, which actually I think is ongoing already, right? We're already doing that in this year. So we budgeted some to accommodate for that, but we're excited about being able to kind of upgrade the technology in there and to some degree come into the 21st century maybe. So that's exciting. Our coffee bar area, obviously we left that the same for many reasons, but one thing I probably should have said before I started, when we sat down and went through this process, one of the things we didn't want to do is just assume that things wouldn't happen. We'll certainly make adjustments as we go throughout next year because we just don't know what all is going to transpire with where we're at with the pandemic and those sorts of things, but we didn't want to assume, for instance, well, there's no way we're having VBS, so let's just take all that money and, there's no way we're going to have a coffee bar. Let's just take that. Like, we want to behave in a way that we believe that God is sovereign and that, if He wants us to have a coffee bar whenever things kind of settle, and we'll have plenty of funds for a coffee bar. So we may upgrade to a premium coffee if we don't use some of that. So that's a joke, but we didn't want to adjust that, assuming that, well, there's no way we'll have a coffee bar. So we left that the same. College and career ministry, really appreciate. Haley gave us some really good feedback. He's had tremendous growth in that group and has had a wonderful opportunity in shepherding those folks. And I think even in this season, as they have different things going on campus that kind of changes the way they can interact and behave, Haley and Kelly have seen a wonderful opportunity to minister to our college age folks. And so they kind of sat down and talked about what that's costing and how the meals and things that they're doing, and that was the request that Haley made, and so we wanted to meet that, and so we upped that by about $450 for next year. The next line is our impact projects. So that covers a plethora of things that we do. Joel's often involved in many of those things, as are Angela and Charlie and Pastor, and that's, I don't want to say that's the slush part of it, but there's a lot of things that can come out of that impact project line. Year to date this year, we've only used about $2,700 of what last year's budget was. So what we did try and look at when we were doing the budget this year, just because we knew we had to make some adjustments to account for that contribution change that we were going to have, is where could we probably take some funds and move them to other areas like missions or wherever it was that we felt like we wouldn't under budget anything for next year. And so the impact projects, we feel more than adequate, even though we've cut that budget technically in half. We feel like that'll be perfectly fine. And often, as you guys will hear about, hopefully by mid-January, when we know where we landed from a total year-end versus our budget, we have what we call our year-end excess funds. And as we do every year, we take those year-end excess funds and say, okay, we're going to use X amount of $1,000 for this. We're going to give this portion to missions. We're going to give this portion to, and we try and allocate that out. So, last year we set aside quite a bit of that and put it in impact projects and some other things. So some of the budget is reflective of just the contributions and the expenses. Our year-end dollars very well will get allocated to some of these areas. So we feel like the impact project is going to be in good shape from a budget perspective. Ladies ministries, that's a pretty sizable increase from previous years, but we left it the same as last year. They haven't spent a ton. I think we doubled it last year to $2,000 from $1,000. And while they've got some wonderful things going on, we didn't increase that anymore just because I think we've only used about $500 this year out of that. So next line is our senior pastor ministry. So much like our impact projects, that entails a lot of different things that Reggie does with his time and the resources that he needs as our senior pastor. Just so everybody knows, we do have a quote on his book spin. So once it caps off, his Amazon just shuts down. He can't order any more books and those sort of things. I give him a hard time about that. But so Reggie had some things he's wanted to do this year, particularly around some education, and that will enhance his senior pastor position, and as we all know, as he in turn turns around and ministers to folks and really shepherds people. We're happy to make that investment in what he needs to do as a senior minister. So we've got his line item adjusted appropriately. So that was about a $4,000 increase in that one. Then we get down into the membership events. So really, the membership events would be anything from breakfasts that we do or potlucks, and obviously that's been very different this year. But once again, we didn't change that line. And then our Truth Quest meals. That is, I can say, of everything that I miss right now, Wednesday nights with the kids and doing some of that is just kind of, I frequently think about that on Wednesdays where I'm headed, because that just wasn't what we were doing months ago. And so we hope that Truth Quest and the meals and everything is going to be right back on the docket in a short while. So we can't predict that, and only God knows that. But we went ahead and budgeted appropriately, because when we start those meals back, there's going to be a lot of hungry people, and we're going to feed them. And so we got the budget set appropriately for that. The next line is, so that's all of our kind of ministry areas and our grow, what we call our grow areas. Then you get down into the BCM meals is on there. So as many of you guys know, we partner with the Baptist Collegiate Ministry, and Haley's the primary person for that, and we provide them funding that they feed actually several hundred students usually on certain days of the month throughout the year. Because of the different restrictions and the things that have happened with ETSU, that expense went way up. So we talked through that with Haley, and we made, I think he felt like about $6,000 would be needed to meet that need. We kind of met him about halfway there, and he's going to get creative with how we do that. But where they were doing more family-style meals that you're kind of dishing out and that sort of thing, now it's got to be boxed and one-off so you can hand off. So that creates a challenge for that, and it's more costly. So we did increase that budget pretty significantly, and we're excited to be able to partner with BCM and meeting that need. The next line is our children's ministry. So we love our children. Children's ministry is a huge thing for our church. We made a few little adjustments based on what Angela and Joel and others had talked about and what they were going to do there, but nothing substantive. I think we changed it by about $850, and still planning on a robust and powerful and impactful vacation Bible school, and we're excited about that. So I know Angela probably loves nothing more than VBS, right? And so we're looking forward to that. We want to budget appropriately for that. Same thing for Joel's student ministry. We didn't really make any changes there. He felt like what he has is adequate. And I'll say, as I heard from several families who, not to speak ill or anything about any other congregation, but who were really struggling what to do with their youth, or what was I went to Willow Spring Park one night, and I think Joel had 30-something kids out there, very appropriately distanced and doing the right things, but they were just having a blast, and they were from other churches or people that didn't go to church, and just they didn't have that time right now, and Joel provided many tremendous opportunities for our young people, especially through the summer when a lot of kind of craziness was going on, and we're really thankful for that and happy to support that going forward. Next line is our worship and media. Charlie really does a yeoman's job of running that, so he put together what he thought he needed for next year, and so we had a little increase there of about $1,200 for next year for that. And then our next line is our deacon ministry. That is very similar to what our impact projects. The deacons, and I've mentioned this before from the pulpit, so the deacons have done an unbelievable amount of work this year. Much of it requiring funding, but the amazing thing about that, when we talk about the faithfulness of our congregation, is year to date they've spent $164 out of last year's budget to meet that need. And that's not because they pinched pennies. That is because so many people came around the deacons and said, you have a need, I'm going to fund it as more of what we call a designated gift. So what that means is that we didn't pull it out of the general budget. We had somebody that says, you need $1,000 for this project, you need $2,000, here it is. And they would send it to the church office anonymously or whatever, and we would use it to fund those things. So our deacons did a ton of work but barely had to use any of their budget because of just the faithfulness of our congregation. So we trying to account for that. We cut that down to 6,000 from 12. But I've talked to Matt and that group several times. We will likely allocate a pretty reasonable amount out of our year-end giving for them, just so they've got that reserve over there if they need it. But we feel like they'll do just fine with that budget as it's set. The safety team ministry, no increase there. We left it the same. We are going to do some things with some additional cameras and some other things that we may use some year-end funds for that. But our safety team has done an amazing job over the last couple of years with the things they've put in place, and so we're thankful for them, and we're happy to still support that part of our ministry. So that total, if you look at all the net changes there, our ministry support line went from $128,525 last year to $124,675. So about a $3,800 or so change. Next couple lines, we got the HBA, so the Holston Baptist Association, and that's just our normal contribution to be part of that. And we are thankful to be able to support them and have a great relationship that we leverage often in that relationship. So that's just a normal line item we have. Then you can see our missions budget. So we left that unchanged. I've had several people ask me about that because we heard from the Hitchcocks this past Sunday, and so there was a sizable part of our budget that was involved in supporting the Hitchcocks, and they're back from the mission field. As David was looking through the missions budget and talking with the different teams he works with, we felt like, there again, we know that God will present a need that we will have funds for, and we will gladly pursue that and support that missions endeavor. And so we didn't want to say, hey, good, we'll throw it in the building fund and go. We wanted to leave our missions budget where it was and use that to serve whatever the need that God presents there. So I think you'll be excited to hear. I know I'm not trying to spoil the fun, but David sent some wonderful pictures of a well project we were just part of in Bolivia, was that? And dug a well and he's got some amazing pictures from the kids and the people that were part of that down there. And so we're supporting things like that from this. So we look forward to tremendous opportunities in 2021 to meet those needs, and we're going to commit to having the funds available to do that. So I will fly through the rest of it quickly because when you get into the rest, it really gets outside the ministry areas, more into the property and those sort of things. So without spending a great deal of time on it, utilities, we just make adjustments there based on what our trends have been. So we adjust for utilities. And then I'm going to show and talk about the van here in just a second, but we typically have budgeted quite a bit for van rentals because the van we had, Joel, as he ran across the parking lot push starting that van from time to time, he would only take it around town, and I was glad because I didn't want my daughter going anywhere lengthy in that, not because the van was unsafe, but it's probably going to break down and we're going to end up going picking them up somewhere. So we still have that van, and Joel tools around town and it has uses it for, but we have a brand new van that we fully funded and paid cash for, got a great discount on it. It's a 15 passenger. We went with a high top for our seniors to be able to use that, so that it would be very comfortable for them to get it out of, and we are really excited about that. And Joel's already put it to good use a couple of times. So I got some pictures here in a second of that. So that's relative because our automotive expense went down about $5,800. And so what we did was we looked at, if you think about a return on investment, we looked at if we bought the van, and year over year that reduces our expense in terms of rentals and fuel and all these sorts of things. We did look at a lease option, but with leasing you can't tow and you can't do some of these things that really Joel often, especially when we do mission trips, we really need to be able to do. So we decided not to go with a lease option that many churches lease their vans. We just we bought that. So thanks to Joel and Gene actually did a lot of work on trying to help us locate and was wheeling and dealing with folks. And so we're grateful to have a wonderful new van. So that changed our automotive expense. From a property standpoint, I'm really just going to hit the highlights of the things that we made adjustments to. Everything else stayed the same. The biggest changes we saw were our parking lot maintenance and our playground maintenance. We just didn't budget anything for that this year because we got some year-end allocations that we're going to use for that. But we also, didn't use particularly the playground to the degree that we have in years past. So, while we will have to replace some mulch possibly and things like that, we don't have to have that same investment that we've made. As you can probably imagine, with if you've not run out of the sanctuary on Sunday and been sprayed with the BioPure or the spray that we use, In our sanitation, that did increase our custodial supplies by about $3,600. So we are really hopeful that that will just go away, but as it stands right now, we are still sanitizing, so we budgeted for that. And then as you go down to kind of the general building maintenance and some of the contracts and some of the supplies, we made some changes in those, the biggest one being the change in that our general fund for building maintenance, and that's just reflective of some wear and tear things we know we need to do, as well as some ongoing sanitation that is part of a company we contract with to do larger parts of the church. So as you guys know, we have Trail Life and other folks that use part of our building. Kingsport Christian Academy, as you heard months ago, is using our building now for their school. We can't, from a custodial perspective, keep track of all that ourselves, so we do outsource some of that to a company that we are glad to be able to provide that, and so that increased that cost a little bit. We took some out of the just general fund from our capital perspective, just to kind of offset the changes we had in the rest of the budget, because that's not really that's not a perfect target that we use for that budget anyway. So all in all, our property went down about $34,000 from last year, and that's just representative of the things that we know will change, will be different for this year. We'll get into our technology. Really, that's left the same, because most of our IT support and our software and our equipment, we didn't make any changes there. Then you get down into the office line items. The only big thing we changed in that was we've typically looked at advertising opportunities and how we could do that, and we budgeted some for that, but we've had some wonderful opportunities with social media and things this year, and so we just really didn't feel like that was money that needed to be budgeted for that, so we made a change of about $3,500 in that budget. And then we did up some of our service contracts related to like our Text to Give app and our prayer app and some of those sort of things. There's kind of ongoing routine maintenance that you pay for as part of those contracts and those models, and so we had a slight increase of about $1,200 or so in that bucket. Really, then that brings you down to the very bottom line. So we budgeted $1,052,000, and we are going to spend $1,052,000. So that's, we're budget neutral on the way that we look at that. There's a picture of the new van, and so you've probably seen it parked out there. Joel will give you a joyride as long as you buckle your seatbelt, so see Joel, and he'll be happy to but we are really excited about that. We've been talking about that for at least a year and a half, and just found the right opportunity to do it. And once again, because of the faithful stewardship, and I know I've said this before, our folks that have been involved with our financial processes in years past did such a wonderful job looking at the storehouses that we needed to have. We got out of debt. What does that look like? And we've got some real opportunity now, and I'm going to talk about that here in a second, but we were able to just say, okay, great. We grabbed the funds and we went and bought it. We didn't have to finance it. We didn't have to incur additional interest expenses and those sort of things, and we feel like that is a wonderful position to be in as a church, that we were able to do that. So go grab a ride in the new van and enjoy that. So let's talk a little bit briefly about kind of something I'm really excited about. I'm going to talk about our reserve model and then our renovation plan. So one of the things that we've been talking about for at least a year now or two, that we just didn't have a lot of time to work through it last year, was what should we look like from a reserve fund perspective. So most of us probably in our own personal lives have I don't call it the rainy day fund, but you've got money set aside for, hey, when the heat pump might go out, or we know that I know a general rule of thumb, and Mitch Toole, who many of you all know, helps me with my financial planning, and we have a 4-month reserve that we have set aside, that if something happens, we were sick or something, we don't have to worry about our financials. And so most of us have some degree of that, or we think that way, and so the church is really no different. So what we've done this year from a financial reserve perspective is we took, I don't know what the exact number is today, because Ginger and I look at this every month and I just haven't seen it for December, but basically when we looked at this, we had about $1.1 million in the bank between our savings and our checking, and of course we account for a certain portion of that that's going out with our expenses, which we average probably about $70,000 a month for that, with just everything we do from a ministry perspective. Even in the COVID time, that's about what we average. So what we did with the reserve plan is we set up an operational reserve. So moving forward, what this will look like is there'll be a reserve that'll just be sitting there kind of untouched, that if we have to tap into that from a church perspective, we have that available. And as I did some research and talked to some church leaders and some very wonderful financial people. About roughly 4 months is a pretty good target for that for a church, and so we will have that set aside should we have any big issues or decline in giving or just something else happens. We've got those dollars set aside as an operational reserve to fund everything we would need to for roughly 4 months. If we had a disruption in any of our contributions. So that's kind of an operational reserve just based on our ministry areas and what we need to do there. The other two big items that we've talked about in years past were reserves that would involve like our HVAC units, right? One of the big panic moments that we had a couple years back was looking at our HVAC units, and I can tell you I work in hospitals, and the hundreds upon thousands of millions of dollars that I'm involved in just in our HVAC units in the hospitals, it does get very costly. So what we wanted to do is use a model where we look back at the expected life of those units, and if we went through how long we think they'll last us, what should we have reserved every single year from the time we installed them to today? What should we have in there that when those things, if and when they go, we're in the same situation we are with the van where we just say, here's what it is, put a new one in. And we feel like that's a really good place that we want to be from our HVAC infrastructure and our roofing, because those are two huge expenses that we are very committed to not have to go into debt if those things were disruptive. And so we set aside that reserve is going to be held for HVAC. And what you'll see, not in this year's budget, but in the 2022 and 2023, is we've developed a target for what would need to be part of the budget every year to continue to roll those dollars into that reserve fund that will be available for us to pull out of to use when those units go down, because we know they will, but we just don't know when. So that's what we did on the HVAC, and the same thing for the roofing. So we went back to a couple years ago when we replaced all of our roofing, and we said, okay, if we had started reserving then, what would we need to be built up to be where we'd need to be today, and then we'll start budgeting next year for that, so that by the time we reach the end of life for the roofing, we've got all the dollars there to just replace the roof. And so that's what we did with those two funds. So you can kind of see what the totals. I apologize I didn't add those up to give you a total on that, but that's basically dollars that we're going to hold in reserve out of what we have right now. The rest kind of rolls into the renovation plan that we've talked about. We've engaged a firm that we've been working with for almost 2 years now, I think, that have the renovation plan for the sanctuary as well as the children's area. They've put all the bid packages and things together. I may have a slide, but yeah, bid packages and the renderings and those things are in process. And so obviously we're going to pray for those things, and we are very much going to involve the congregation in those decisions, because we may get to the point where we've put all that out and we just decide that is not where God's leading us, and if not, we will find other ways to use the funding. So we want to get those quotes back and get some bids back on what that would look like for the bathrooms out in the lobby area. I think I've went over all this a couple times before, and particularly not aesthetic like just people focused, but some things that we need to do here in the sanctuary to upgrade some things and do things a little differently. And then the one that we're probably have the most passion about is our children's area. It just desperately needs some upgrades and things in there. So we're going to have those go out for bid, and then if we decide as a congregation that that's what we want to pursue, based on raw material and where things are at right now, as some of you guys may be aware with the pandemic, that is a challenging situation. We would hope to have either or project complete by Easter would be the goal. So we didn't set aside a budget for that, but just to back up, the plan is for that. If you think about the $1.1 million I said we have in the bank, and then what we use on a monthly basis based on what we will see every month in terms of giving, the delta between these reserve funds and that $1.1 million makes up the chunk that we have available basically to fund any renovation projects or other things that we want to do. So there again, we are in a position, because of the stewardship, the faithfulness, all these things we talked about, to if we decide those are what we want to do as a congregation, there's no borrowing, we will fund it and pay for it and be able to go that direction without having to incur any debt or anything of that nature. So that is everything I have that I wanted to cover, and I will stop right there and see. I don't know if Reggie, any text? You got any questions?
One question you answered about ministry, I sent that to you, but you've already answered that.
Okay.
And then one for David, but David responded to me and I forwarded it back to the person.
Okay, so we'll monitor the cell phone, see if anything comes in. What questions do you guys have that are here present? And you may have to be loud, and I can answer those.
I want to get my number out again.
Yep, so for the live stream, if you want to text, if you joined us a few minutes, Reggie's cell phone number is 676-2676, 676-2676. So feel free to just shoot a text to Reggie, and any questions you have, I'd be happy to answer those. So what do we have from anybody here in the sanctuary? Yes, sir.
I've not been able to be here much this year, but this may have already been done regarding upgrading of the bathrooms of our senior folks and handicapped folks that have a difficult time under the present conditions, with the commodes and stuff like that.
So I'll let Ginger keep me honest on this. How many did we do? Just the one commode, and how many have we done? 100 wing ladies and men's, and then some of the other capital, particularly we have for next year, are with some rails and some bars. One of the things we really wanted to do that we got some feedback from some of our seniors and other folks were to have some railing that would go around at least the perimeter here that makes it a little bit easier if you have a challenge there to be able to kind of get down the hallway. I don't know how many different sets of railings we looked at to try and find the right, and then as much as we want to do those things very quickly, raw materials and some of the things that have happened with the pandemic astronomically increased the price. And so in a time when there may not be as much traffic in those areas, we're trying to balance the stewardship of that. But we did do some of the toilets and do some upgrades there, and we've got the railing. And I don't know, was there anything else, Ginger, that was part of that I can recall? And of course, the renovation project for the main lobby here, there's a lot of ADA type upgrades that we need to do in the bathrooms. So for those of y'all that are not familiar with those kinds of things, the second we start any type of project like that, we basically are required at that point to get everything up to more of an ADA standard, which would the American Disability Act. So there's a lot of stall spacing, those sort of things. So that's why it's really important that we don't just start a project, that we know what we would need to do to bring it up to par. And that's a big part of that renovation. Is there's some, even here in the sanctuary, we really need some areas. We had talked about cutting out some pews just because from an ADA seating perspective, we should have some landings where you could park a wheelchair and those sort of things. Now, you're kind of grandfathered into those things if you've never had them, but once you start doing renovations, you have to address those needs. So there's some additional things we're going to be looking at with the bathrooms. Did that answer your question? Okay. Right. Yes, Vic.
What catastrophic events might occur that we would have to get into that $1 million reserve?
So, if you think about the 1.1 million, that really represents a checking and saving portion. So, some of that is just general funding we're using, on a monthly basis, just like our bank accounts with our personal bank accounts. When you think about the $280,000, it's really that operational reserve. Those could be scenarios like, not unlike the pandemic, even though we've seen a difference there. But there are churches that had to very much dip into those type of operational reserves because. I was actually talking with and reviewing a church that was in Washington, D.C., and you don't think about these kinds of things, but because of even just the change in the election process, you've got a whole host of people that are in that church that now either lose a job or don't have an income, and that significantly changes the giving in that particular congregation. And so, there's no magic number on that, Vic. We just we felt like that 280 was, 4 months is kind of a model your Dave Ramsey's and folks like that would recommend. But it could be a host of things. It could be a natural disaster event that took down the church, and then we had to go rent a place and had to worship like that. Those are the basic scenarios that recommendation follows. The HVAC and the roofing is a little different in that we're not really reserving for some kind of catastrophic failure of the roof, but when we reach a point we're going to have to spend another $200,000-$300,000 to replace the roof, we don't want to have to then cut back on ministry areas because we got to meet that need and we don't want to finance it. And so, if you think about where we've been in years past, there again, we did a wonderful job of stewardship, but there were years where we said, look, we've got to do this with the roof. We're going to have to cut children's here and cut this here and cut this here to meet that need. We would rather be in a position where when that need we can just meet that need, and that's a reserve. The HVAC units are a much higher likelihood to just and then we've got to deal with that. I can tell you from personal experience, those don't often just completely blow up and you have to invest $100,000 in one. But, one of the things that Ginger and I track is kind of ongoing maintenance, because there is a point of diminishing returns where if I've got to continue to put $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 into a unit every month because, the compressor goes or this goes or that goes, it would really behoove me in the investment to just buy a new unit. So, most of these units were bought about the same time. So that in and of itself creates a kind of a waterfall, if you will, of when they start going down, they might all likely go down, and then we've got a huge expense on our hands that we just don't want to have to go to the bank to borrow. So that is more of probably a catastrophic thing that could happen with the HVAC systems. I don't think we're going to have 8 of them go down at once, but Lord willing, we'll be prepared for that when it happens. So did that answer your question? Okay.
If you get a question, could you repeat it so the folks on the live stream can hear?
Oh, yeah, that's great. So Vic's question was what would we use the reserve funds for? And the other question was related to some bathroom renovations that we're doing with some ADA or some requests from our folks, our wonderful seniors that, just those bathrooms are a little tight and they need a little bit of an upgrade. So that was the first question. What other questions do we have here in the sanctuary? Or anything I didn't cover that you just need more detail about? It doesn't have to be a question necessarily. Yes, ma'am.
So we got the new van,
Mm-hmm.
but if we do take a trip to a long trip that needs 2 vans, are we going to rent another van for the excessive people if that's only 15 passengers?
Yes. So basically, if we go back to that administrative line or that automotive line, we typically had budgeted for basically 2 vans and the fuel and all those sort of things. In this model, we've got enough for 1 van, and then we've got our own van, and which is nice. If it is local, even if it's just a bigger group, we've got our van plus the older van we can still use. Then we may not have to rent one. But for the longer distance trips or our missions types trips, the other thing that we want to make sure we have is if Samaritan's Purse has a need, which many of you guys have been on those trips, and Joel does a wonderful job connecting with that group. If he's got to take our van and go down there and we still need another one for a seniors or whatever, we don't have to. We may rent one and send it with Joel, and then we've got ours here to use, so we don't end up renting 2. And really, like I said, when you modeled that out over a number of years, we'll save by investing in the van, especially because we paid cash and we were able to just get a really good deal on it, and so that we're not financing anything. But yes, we do have funds set aside to rent another van. And I hope we got enough kids going to the next event that we got to rent 3 vans. And if we do, we will pull those funds from somewhere, I promise. And just like missions, I've said this in a couple other times we talked about our budget. Our goal should be to so propagate what we're doing from a ministry perspective that we don't have enough money to fund it, because that means the work that we're doing is so impactful that because God will make a way. I have no doubt about it. He will increase the harvest there, and we will find the funds, because if we didn't budget enough to rent an extra van, we'll rent one, because that's that many kids going to or another missions team we're sending. And I think we're in a great place to be able to do that. And I guess back to Vic's question, those are other scenarios that I could see we may dip into those operational funds if we need, while that's a reserve fund, if we really found an opportunity to say, man, if we sent a missions group here, that's definitely somewhere we could go grab $20,000 and do it, and we wouldn't have to make an adjustment somewhere else and say, now, Joel, you're going to have to order less pizza. We don't want to do that. Slow down on the pizza there. Not a lot of salad going on with the youth group, more pizza. What other questions can I answer for you? Did that answer your question, Lynette? Okay. Anything else? David, missions, anything you want to? Joel, anything from you, sir, that you want to? Charlie's up there, and he can wave at me. He can always come down if he needs. I can't. So if he's got, Angela, anything from your perspective you want to? Pastor, how about you? So I really appreciate everyone's time. Really, please digest this. I know it's kind of wonky, but I often have a copy of our budget and kind of pray over that, and just because it is such a reflection, and I can't tell you, get emotional thinking about it, but as we were starting into the pandemic, and the elders in particular were having discussions about what this would look like, while we did hold off on moving aggressively to some of those renovation projects because those were just big expenses, we didn't want to make any. we knew we had faith that God had a plan, and that there wasn't some just massive change we needed to make on what we were doing with our budget. Let's keep funding stuff. We looked for new opportunities to spend, and the faithfulness of our congregation just blew me away. I mean, it doesn't surprise me necessarily, because I think it just shows off God, and God is way more impressive than I give him credit for. But it did show off the hearts of our folks, that our deacons did all the work our deacons did and spent $157. There again, that's more. Joel spends more than that on pizza when he feeds the youth. So maybe I need to have Joel connect with the deacons and figure out how to work like that. But that just there again is representative of the hearts of our people. And so we are so grateful for all of you all, everyone's on the live stream, and what really this spiritual mutual fund is for Heritage and for the work that we do. So please pray over the budget. Please pray over the specifics there. I will be more than happy. I'll hang around for a minute if you've got specific questions you just didn't want to ask. I'll be down here. And then over the coming days and weeks, if you think of anything that you just weren't clear about, or you feel strongly should look differently, or there's something we can do, please let us know. Let Ginger know, Pastor, anybody, anybody in the leadership group or the elders or any of that group. And then, if you're interested in being part of the process and getting more regular updates and reviews, it's been a little different in the last couple of months with COVID and all, but let me know. I'll be happy to put you on that group. We've met a couple of times before the pandemic started, and then since then we've done more some Zoom type things, but I'd love to have anybody that wants to be part of that process. So anything else before we close? All right, well, let me close this in prayer, and like I said, I'll be down here should you have any questions. Heavenly Father, we once again just are in awe of your goodness and what you are in our lives, and we just pray that overflows in our hearts in such a way that we can't help but give. We can't help but use the resources and the goodness that you've given us, whether it is the last penny we have or 90% of what we have, that desire we have in our hearts, that the truth we speak from the pulpit, what our ministry areas reflect in the hearts of our people would only bring more people to not to give, it's not about the amount on the line item of the budget. It's about the faithfulness in that. And we pray that we would be a church that shows a broken world the faithfulness that we have in you, and how the stock market or even our own personal losses that we may have sustained or any of those sort of things didn't impact the way we showed up to be faithful in our giving and in the use of those funds to support the work of the church. So we know 2021 that you are sovereign, and that but Lord, we pray and we hope that we are gathered together for Truth Quest meals, and we are taking mission trips, and we have new mission opportunities, and we have very rich fellowship, and that in all that we can be found faithful, and that the giving we have supports that. And we are thankful for our people, for our elders, and for just the opportunity to serve you, even as broken as we are sometimes when we do it. It's in your heavenly name we pray. Amen.